They laughed before they saw him properly, a ripple of crystal chimes and silk sleeves through the amphitheater as the alien princess leaned back upon her throne of living glass, her smile a blade wrapped in velvet, because the human stood alone at the center of the ancient ring, unadorned, unarmored, hands empty, eyes level, and the crowd had waited a century for spectacle, for blood, for another brave species to break itself against the right that ended wars by proving who deserved to rule. And she mocked his strength with a tilt of her chin and a lazy wave of her fingers, saying that the human would be given mercy if he knelt now, because the arena did not enjoy cleaning fragile things from the stone. And the translators carried her scorn like perfume through the stands, and the human breathed once, slow and deep, as if he were measuring the weight of the world and finding it light. The arena itself remembered wars older than her crown, its layered rings etched with victories and defeats, scars filled with luminous moss, pylons humming with field generators that could crush tanks into petals, because the right was not meant to be fair, it was meant to be final. And the princess knew this. Everyone knew this. The champions before had been titans plated in suns, beasts bred for impact, scions whose thoughts could shear mountains, and they had all failed at one trial or another. And so the princess laughed again, softer now, indulgent, calling him little starless one, asking if his people truly believed bones and sinew could stand against history. And the crowd roared approval, eager for the first hazard to tear him apart. He remembered why he stood there, though he did not look away from her eyes. He remembered the ships burned at the edge of his system, the quiet cities turned to glass, the treaties folded into ash by the same empire that now smiled and offered mercy. He remembered the long years of holding lines with rationed hope, of teaching children to sleep through alarms, and he remembered the council vote that had sent him alone, because humanity had learned that wars lasted until someone was willing to end them in a way that could not be argued with, and so he had trained in silence, not with machines alone but with restraint, with the discipline of waiting until the moment meant everything. The first hazard rose without ceremony, plates of the floor sliding aside to reveal a lattice of gravity wells, invisible hands that twisted space into spirals, meant to pull bodies into ribbons, and the princess leaned forward now, anticipation brightening her gaze, because this was where giants fell screaming. And the human stepped once, then again, not fast, not slow, placing his feet as if crossing a shallow stream, feeling the pull and letting it pass through him, aligning his mass and breath so the forces argued with each other and found no purchase. And the stands fell into a murmur as he reached the far edge untouched, his hair stirring only from his own motion. The princess frowned, a crack in porcelain, and she lifted 2 fingers, escalating the trial. Energy pylons flared and arcs of incandescent force lanced across the ring, slicing the air into hot petals, and the human moved at last, a simple turn of the shoulders, a step that curved instead of dodged, letting the arcs kiss the wake of his passage. And the translators struggled to keep up with the crowd noise as surprise edged into irritation, because this was not how it was supposed to go. And the princess said something sharp to her attendants, a command that tasted like iron. She rose, voice carrying without amplification, telling him that cleverness would only delay the inevitable, that strength was the language of rule. And he answered her then, not loud, but steady, saying that strength was also the discipline to stop, that a war measured in centuries had forgotten what it was fighting for. And the laughter returned in bursts, but thinner now, and somewhere in the tears an elder leaned forward, recognizing a cadence older than pride. The arena shifted again, blades unfolded from the walls, a storm of rotating edges, and the human closed his eyes for a heartbeat, not in prayer but in calculation, recalling the drills where he had learned to feel time as texture, to choose where to place the smallest effort for the greatest change. And he stepped into the storm, not fighting every blade, but touching one at the right instant, redirecting its axis by a whisper of force, and the chain reaction bloomed, blades colliding, energy cancelling energy, until the storm unraveled into harmless sparks that rained like cold fire, and silence spread, heavy and complete. The princess stared now, mockery gone, replaced by something like offense, because the right was her inheritance, her theater of certainty. And this human had turned it into a lesson, and she said that even if he endured every trial, the final measure remained, the strike that proved dominion, because the war would not end until someone struck with unquestioned authority. And he opened his eyes and looked at the distant banners, the emblems of conquered worlds, and nodded once, accepting the premise while rejecting the cruelty beneath it. As the final platform rose, a monolith of compressed fields meant to resist gods, the crowd leaned forward as one body, breath held, because here was where legends ended, and the human placed his palm against the surface, not striking yet, listening to the hum of 100 generators, to the resonance that bound them, and he smiled, just a little, because he understood now. And somewhere beyond the arena, fleets waited, weapons charged, ready to resume a war that had forgotten how to stop, and the princess lifted her hand to signal the end of patience, unaware that patience was the last thing he had left to give. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured, spreading in thin lines through the amphitheater as whispers dared to exist again, because the human had not struck, his palm still resting against the monolith, eyes half closed as if listening to something no one else could hear, and the princess felt heat rise behind her eyes, not fear yet, but insult, the sharp ache of a ritual slipping from her control, and she ordered the generators to full resonance, a command that made the air thicken and the light bend, because the monolith was not merely a wall, it was a memory of power, layered with the triumphs of her ancestors, tuned to resist brute force and clever force alike, designed so that only overwhelming dominance could leave a mark. The hum deepened, vibrating bone and thought, and the crowd recoiled as if from a storm wind, many shielding their faces, because this was the sound that had ended 100 rebellions, the sound that told the species it had reached the edge of its story. And the human breathed out slowly, fingers spreading, feeling the feedback loop scream against his skin, and instead of pushing, he leaned in, placing his weight where the resonance folded inward, not fighting the field, but joining its rhythm. And somewhere in the machine logic, a contradiction bloomed, because the monolith had never been asked to hold something that did not resist it. The princess saw the readout spike, colors flaring in alarm, and she snapped orders, layering force upon force, gravity tightening, energy density rising, until the air around the human shimmered like molten glass, and still he did not strike, and this refusal cut deeper than defiance, because the right demanded spectacle, demanded the violence of certainty, and the human was denying her that language, turning the arena into a conversation she did not control. He thought of Earth then, not of its weapons, but of its weight, of oceans held in place by balance, of tectonic plates that moved not with rage but inevitability, of cities rebuilt on fault lines because people learned to listen to the ground, and he remembered his instructors telling him that strength was not the loudest force, but the one that arrived at the right moment and changed everything with the smallest possible touch. And he opened his eyes fully, focusing on the seam where the monolith met the platform, where ancient pride had left a flaw. The first sound was not an explosion but a sigh, a release so subtle that only the elders in the stands noticed, because they had heard it once before, centuries ago, when a star had shed its outer shell and rewritten the maps, and a hairline fracture traced itself across the monolith, light leaking out like dawn through stone, and the crowd gasped as one, the shock rolling through them in a physical wave, and the princess froze, her hands still raised, because this was impossible, because the right had never recorded a fracture, not even from gods. The human stepped back, removing his palm, and the fracture held, glowing softly, not widening, not shattering, simply existing, undeniable. And he spoke again, voice steady, saying that this was what restraint looked like, that he could have broken it, but breaking things was easy, ending wars was harder. And the translators carried his words with painful clarity, because there was no boast in them, only fact. Anger flared at last in the princess, sharp and bright, and she descended from the throne, armor unfolding around her in living plates, her crown dimming into a helm, because the right allowed one final escalation, the sovereign's challenge, where ruler faced challenger directly, and the war hung on that moment like a blade, and she drew her weapon, a spear of condensed light that sang as it formed, tuned to her genetic signature, lethal beyond comprehension, and the crowd erupted, because this was the ending they understood. She advanced without hesitation, each step cracking the stone, spear lancing forward with speed that bent perception, and the human moved, finally abandoning stillness, his body aligning with the strike, not meeting it head-on but slipping inside its arc, his hand closing around the shaft where energy and matter met, skin smoking, muscles screaming, and for a heartbeat the arena held its breath, because no one had ever touched a sovereign spear and lived. The feedback was catastrophic, alarms screaming, because the spear did not know how to be held, its equations unraveling under contradictory inputs, and the human twisted, redirecting the force into the ground, where it tore a glowing trench through layers of ancient stone, venting into the deep substrates, and the princess staggered, shock flashing across her face as she felt the weapon's song falter. Her perfect control slipping, she struck again, faster, fury sharpening her movements, and he, not with equal force but with timing. Each deflection a lesson, each step an invitation to overcommit, and the crowd watched in stunned silence as their sovereign, trained since birth in the art of dominance, was drawn into a rhythm she did not set, her attacks growing more desperate as his remained precise, economical, almost gentle. Blood was drawn then, a thin line across his shoulder, and a roar rose from the stands, because finally the human bled, finally he looked mortal, and the princess seized on that, pressing her advantage, spear blazing brighter, and he felt the edge of his endurance, the cost of holding back mounting with every breath, and he knew that the moment was approaching, the one his people had sent him to choose. He remembered the fleets waiting, the trigger fingers poised, the war plans measured in acceptable losses, and he saw the future branching, one path where he struck with everything and reduced the arena to rubble, ending the war through terror, another where he failed and humanity burned, and a third, narrow and difficult, where he struck once, precisely, at the fulcrum of belief, and changed the story. As the princess lunged, committing fully, he stepped inside her guard, closer than any opponent had ever dared, and placed his hand against her chest plate, feeling the resonance of her armor, the echo of the monolith's design, and he struck then, not with a blow but with a pulse, a focused release of all the restraint he had gathered, delivered at the exact frequency that bound her systems together, and the effect rippled outward, silent, devastating, her armor dimmed, systems cascading into shutdown, the spear dissolving into harmless light, and the princess fell to one knee, not wounded but undone, her power stripped away in an instant, and the arena lights flickered as the monolith's fracture flared brighter, resonating with the strike, and far above, sensors in waiting fleets spiked, registering a signature they had never seen. The human stood over her, breathing hard now, the cost finally due, and he did not raise his hand again. He offered it instead, and in that gesture, simple and impossible, the meaning of the strike became clear. Because he had not destroyed her, he had destroyed the certainty that justified the war, and the crowd began to understand, a low murmur spreading as centuries of belief shifted, and somewhere deep in the Empire's machinery, ancient protocols awakened, recognizing defeat without annihilation, and preparing, at last, for an ending. The princess's hand hovered inches from his, trembling, not from pain but from the shock of standing inside a moment that history had never prepared her for, because every lesson she had learned said power ended arguments, and yet here was power withdrawn, offered back as choice, and the arena waited, frozen between breaths, because if she took his hand, the right would bend, and if she refused it would shatter, and she looked up at him, truly looked, seeing not a conqueror but a boundary, something solid enough to stop a century of momentum. Around them the elders stirred, ancient beings whose lifespan spanned wars like seasons, their crests dimming and flaring as they consulted silent channels, because the protocols were awake now, old code written when the Empire still remembered fear, clauses that spoke of an outcome no ruler liked to imagine, defeat without destruction, and the fracture in the monolith pulsed in time with those buried laws, as if the arena itself were reminding them of forgotten possibilities. The princess took his hand, and the sound that followed was not applause but release, a collective exhale rolling through tens of thousands of throats, because the right acknowledged the gesture, lights shifting from crimson to white, weapons safeties locking across the stands, and far beyond the arena, in the cold dark where fleets waited, targeting matrices flickered and dimmed, commanders hesitating as confirmation signals failed to arrive. She rose with his help, pride bleeding away into something raw and dangerous, because surrender without annihilation left space for doubt, and doubt was a luxury rulers were taught to excise. And yet, she felt lighter without her armor, its dead weight sloughing off into motes of light, and she spoke, voice no longer amplified by throne or crown, asking him what he thought would happen next, because the war could not simply end, not after so much had been invested in its continuation. He answered honestly, saying that some would resist, that admirals and ministers would cling to the old logic, that humanity was prepared for that, but that the strike had not been for them, it had been for everyone watching, for the idea that strength only moved in one direction. And as he spoke, the crowd leaned in, not as spectators but as witnesses, because this was the real trial now. Words spoken where weapons had failed. A ripple of movement drew their attention upward, to the imperial balcony, where the High Regent stood, ancient and terrible, having watched the right from behind layers of political insulation, and the regent's many eyes focused on the human, calculating, because the empire had faced rebels before, had crushed them with righteous efficiency, but this was different. This was a victory that did not offer the satisfaction of ruins, and the regent knew that denying it outright would fracture loyalty faster than accepting it. The regent descended slowly, each step a concession, and addressed the arena, acknowledging the outcome in careful language, invoking tradition and continuity, declaring that the war's mandate had been fulfilled, because the right existed to test supremacy, and supremacy had been demonstrated in a way the law could not ignore. And with those words, ancient seals broke, treaties long frozen thawing into relevance, and across the empire, systems felt the shift. On the human side of the galaxy, signals arrived in bursts, encrypted channels lighting up with data that analysts stared at in disbelief, because the strike signature propagated faster than expected, a clean, unmistakable marker that the right had resolved. And admirals who had prepared themselves to die gave orders to stand down, relief and suspicion warring in equal measure, because humanity had learned not to trust sudden peace. Back in the arena, dissent found its voice at last, a noble shouting that the right had been corrupted, that the human had cheated, that restraint was a trick unworthy of rule. And for a moment the old fear stirred, because empires fell when certainty cracked unevenly. But the princess turned on the noble, eyes blazing, and said that if restraint were weakness, the empire would never have survived its first century. And the crowd roared approval, because they remembered then, faintly, stories of founders who had chosen mercy as strategy. The human felt the cost of his strike settling into his bones, exhaustion dragging at him like gravity, and medics approached cautiously, alien and human alike, because this moment mattered more than pride, and he allowed them to steady him, knowing that the image would travel farther than any speech. The victor supported, not exalted, and somewhere a child would see it and learn a different lesson about power. Negotiations began before the dust had fully settled, because momentum was a thing to be seized, not admired, and the princess insisted on being present, refusing to retreat into ceremony, because this was her responsibility now, the consequence of mocking what she did not understand. And as terms were spoken, reparations outlined, borders reconsidered, the war's scaffolding creaked, centuries of assumption bending under the weight of a single moment. There were setbacks, of course, skirmishes sparked by commanders who refused to believe, by worlds too scarred to trust, and reports of those conflicts reached the arena even as talks continued. And the human listened, jaw tight, because ending a war was not the same as healing from it, and he knew that his strike had only opened the door. Others would have to walk through it, slowly, painfully. The princess asked him, in a quieter moment, if he regretted not destroying the monolith completely, if a clean break would have been easier, and he considered the glowing fracture, still there, still humming, and said that breaks could be repaired in ways fractures could not, that a visible flaw reminded people to be careful with what they built next, and she nodded, because she understood then that the arena would never feel the same again. As the day stretched into a cycle, the amphitheater emptied, leaving echoes and light, and the human stood once more at the center, alone now, feeling the enormity of what had been done settling like snow. And he thought of the long road ahead, of tribunals and truth commissions, of rebuilding trust one system at a time, and he smiled faintly, because for the first time in a century, the future was not already written. Far above, the fleets began to turn, massive silhouettes altering course, weapons powering down, and the stars themselves seemed to shift, as if relieved of a tension they had held too long. And in that vast movement, born from a single restrained strike, the meaning of humanity's choice rippled outward, not as conquest, but as an invitation to imagine an end that did not require extinction. And the galaxy, weary and wounded, began to listen. Peace did not arrive like a banner unfurled. It crept in sideways, hesitant, wrapped in clauses and contingencies. And the days after the right were heavier than the day of the strike, because everyone involved understood that stopping momentum was not the same as reversing it, and the arena became a provisional chamber, its ancient stones now listening to negotiations instead of screams, while the fracture in the monolith glowed softly as a reminder that certainty had limits. Delegations arrived in waves, species that had bent knee to the empire, others that had resisted and paid for it, all carrying their own versions of the warlike scars beneath ceremonial fabrics, and they looked at the human with a mixture of awe and resentment, because he had done in a moment what they had failed to do in generations, and envy has always been the shadow of hope. The princess took her place among them, no longer elevated above, insisting that her chair be level with the rest, a symbolic act that unsettled her court more than any concession, because hierarchy was their language of comfort, and flattening it felt like standing on untested ground. But she held firm, learning in real time what it meant to rule after certainty had been stripped away. The regent maneuvered carefully, offering reforms in measured doses, trying to preserve the empire's core while shedding the excesses that had fueled the war, and the human watched, understanding the dance, because Earth's own history was a litany of empires, learning too late that survival required change, and he spoke only when necessary, choosing moments where a single sentence could reframe an argument, his restraint still a weapon. There were voices that called for his execution, whispers of assassination plots threaded through back channels, because peace threatened livelihoods built on war, and those who had grown powerful feeding the conflict were not eager to starve, and security tightened. Mixed units of imperial guards and human operatives learning to trust each other in increments, because trust was now the rarest currency. News from the front lines trickled in, some hopeful, some grim, systems where ceasefires held, others where old hatreds flared the moment oversight weakened, and each report weighed on the princess, because these were her people and not her people, victims and perpetrators tangled beyond easy separation. And she began to understand that ending a war was less about victory and more about responsibility that never truly ended. The humans spent long hours in quiet consultation with survivors, refugees brought to the capital for testimony, listening to stories that did not fit neatly into policy, because numbers were easier than names, and empires preferred abstraction. But he insisted on specifics, on faces, because he knew that if the peace forgot why it existed, it would collapse into convenience. One evening, as artificial dusk washed the city in amber light, the princess asked him if humanity hated her. The question stripped of ceremony, and he considered it carefully, saying that some would, some already did, but that hatred was a poor foundation for the future, and that humanity had learned, painfully, that enemies who remained enemies forever eventually defined you, and she absorbed that in silence, realizing how much of her identity had been shaped by opposition. Resistance coalesced at last, not as open rebellion but as coordinated obstruction, governors delaying implementation, admirals reinterpreting orders, legalists exploiting loopholes older than their stars, and the regent hesitated, calculating the cost of enforcement, and all eyes turned to the human, because the unspoken question lingered, whether he would strike again, whether restraint had limits. He answered without words, requesting access to the monolith, and when granted, he placed his hand against the glowing fracture once more, not to deepen it, but to resonate with it, and across the empire, the systems tied to the right responded, ancient failsafes activating, authority rerouting around obstructors, because the law itself recognized the outcome, and those who resisted found their power evaporating, not through violence, but through The message was unmistakable. The strike had not been a singular miracle. It had rewritten the rules under which power flowed, and those who could not adapt were left behind. And while some cursed the human's name, others began to study him, to teach their children a different story about strength. On Earth, celebrations were muted, because victory felt complicated, and memorials still outnumbered parades. But there was relief, a loosening of a collective breath held for too long, and the knowledge that for the first time in generations, children might grow up without learning the sound of orbital bombardment as lullaby. The human received messages from home, from old instructors, from family who had feared they would never see him again, and he read them slowly, grounding himself in their ordinariness, because it was easy to become a symbol and forget the person beneath, and he refused to let the galaxy turn him into a myth detached from consequence. As weeks turned into months, frameworks solidified, mixed courts established, reparations began their long, insufficient journey, and cultural exchanges replaced some military deployments, tentative and awkward, but real. And the princess traveled to worlds she had only known as entries and ledgers, seeing devastation that softened her anger and hardened her resolve. She returned changed, quieter, more deliberate. And when she spoke in council now, it was with an authority that did not rely on spectacle. And even those who disliked her listened, because she had faced the fracture and not turned away, and that mattered more than lineage. The arena was finally closed, declared a heritage site, no longer a place of trial by domination, but of remembrance. And visitors walked its rings in silence, touching the stone, looking at the monolith with its luminous scar, and guides told the story carefully, emphasizing not the strike itself, but the choice behind it. Asterisk. On the anniversary of the rite, the human returned alone, standing where he had first been mocked, feeling the echo of that laughter fade into something distant, and he wondered whether peace would last, whether another century would bring another arena, another test, and he accepted that uncertainty as the price of hope, because certainty, he had learned, was the most dangerous weapon of all. The final reckoning did not arrive with betrayal or battle. It arrived with choice, quiet and relentless, pressing itself into every corner of the new peace until there was no one left who could pretend it was temporary. And the galaxy discovered that ending a century-long war was not a single event, but a sustained act of will, repeated daily by millions who had learned to survive through conflict and now had to learn something harder: how to live without it. The human felt the weight of that truth most sharply as time passed, because the myth had begun to crystallize around him despite his resistance. Stories simplifying what had been complex, turning restraint into legend, and legend into expectation. And he worked tirelessly to undermine his own pedestal, appearing in classrooms and reconstruction zones, speaking plainly about fear and doubt, about how close everything had come to catastrophe, because he knew that myths invited imitation without understanding. The princess, no longer sheltered by ritual or inevitability, faced her own final trial, not in an arena but in governance, where every decision carried consequences that could not be burned away by force, and she learned to listen, truly listen. Two worlds that spoke with anger, grief, and exhaustion, and in doing so she shed the last remnants of mockery that had once defined her, becoming something rarer than a conqueror, a custodian. The regent eventually stepped aside, citing tradition, but everyone understood it for what it was, an acknowledgement that the empire he had shaped could not survive unchanged. And new councils formed, imperfect and contentious, but open. And while corruption did not vanish, and old prejudices did not evaporate, the machinery of war slowly rusted from disuse, its vast budgets and doctrines repurposed, awkwardly at first, into infrastructure, relief, and shared research. There were still flare-ups, pirates cloaked in old banners, extremists invoking the purity of endless struggle. But they found fewer recruits, because the narrative had shifted, because children on distant worlds grew up hearing not only how the war had been fought, but how it had ended, with one strike that refused to destroy. And that story spread faster than any fleet ever had. Years passed, and the human aged visibly, lines etching his face, his body bearing the quiet costs of what he had done, because even restraint left marks, and he welcomed them, reminders that the choice had been real and finite, not divine. And when asked if he would do it again, he answered honestly, saying he did not know. And that uncertainty was precisely why no one else should try to be him. The princess visited Earth at last, not as an emissary of dominance but as a guest, walking memorial fields where names outnumbered flowers, standing beside oceans whose scale humbled even her, and she bowed her head, not in ceremony but in recognition. And when she spoke to humanity's councils, she did not defend the empire's past, she accepted it. And that acceptance did more to solidify peace than any concession ever could. Together they returned once more to the arena, now overgrown with living stone and soft light, the monolith's fracture still glowing, unchanged by time, and they stood without guards, without spectacle, two figures once defined by opposition, now linked by consequence. And the princess asked him if he believed the war was truly over, and he answered that wars ended when people stopped teaching their children why they should begin again. As if in answer, delegations of young beings moved through the arena, students from dozens of species, touching the walls, asking questions that were not about tactics but about choice, about fear, about how it felt to stand alone under mockery and not strike back immediately. And the human listened as the princess answered them. her words careful, honest, acknowledging her own failure, and in that moment he knew the strike had fully landed. When his time came, quietly, without ceremony, the galaxy noticed the absence more than the passing, because there was no explosion, no final act, just a slowing of a life that had carried too much, and messages poured in, not of worship, but of gratitude, and memorials were raised that did not depict him as a warrior, but as a figure with an open hand. The princess spoke at his remembrance, voice steady, saying that the century-long war had ended not because someone was stronger, but because someone had been strong enough to stop, and that this truth frightened empires more than any weapon, and she pledged that, as long as she ruled, the arena would never again be used to justify domination. Time moved on, as it always did, eroding even the sharpest memories, but the fracture remained, a luminous scar that no one repaired, because scars were not failures. They were evidence, and whenever tensions rose, whenever fleets postured and rhetoric sharpened, leaders returned to that place, standing before the monolith, remembering that a single restrained strike had once ended 100 years of blood. And so the galaxy learned, unevenly and imperfectly, that power did not have to announce itself with annihilation, that the greatest force was sometimes the one that refused to go further. And while conflicts never vanished entirely, they no longer defined the age, because one human, mocked for his weakness, had proven that strength was not measured by how hard you could strike, but by knowing when one strike was enough.